War has come to the wild. Rumors say a secret group of powerful animals conspired in an underground bunker to find a way to conquer the cycle of the seasons. There, they worked to fuse formidable technologies and perilous magic to develop a new source of endless warmth and power. Now, their machines are rampaging across the Commonwood, enclosing every habitat, town, and village in their path. Still, there are whispers of hope. Scrappy crews of animals calling themselves Defenders of the Wild are rising up to resist the machine occupation, fighting back with guerrilla tactics and clandestine sabotage. Can the defenders band together to heal the land and outsmart a seemingly impossible enemy? Or will the Commonwood succumb to an endless industrial winter? It's up to you and your comrades to decide. Hello everybody, welcome to Totally Tabled. My name is Shaggy, and today I'm doing a sponsored tutorial for Defenders of the Wild, a new cooperative board game for 1 to 4 players from Outlandish Games. Please keep in mind that I made a previous tutorial video about a year ago during the game's crowdfunding campaign, which used an older version of the rules. This tutorial reflects the final version of the game with fully updated rules and components. In Defenders of the Wild, players will take the role of an organizer for 1 of 4 animal factions. The Order, with their Wisdom of the Flame, the Council, driven by fairness and solidarity, the Sect, makers of ingenious inventions, and the Coven, bearers of spells and subterfuge. These factions must put aside long-standing disagreements in order to join forces in this war against the rampaging machines. Now, I went ahead and I got everything set up for a 2-player game. You want to construct the frame and then randomize the terrain tiles to create a unique map. Make sure the arrows in the middle of the tiles all face the same direction, and place the center base tile in the middle. Icons along the outside of the frame show which adjacent habitat hexes start with a mech, and the icons on some of the tiles show which start with pollution tokens. You'll want to fill the toxic site circle with 6 toxic site tokens, and place the direction circle nearby with a pawn on the arrow pointing to the right, which has 1 gear beside it. To set up the central machine core, stack all of the 6 factory tiles in numerical order from 0 at the bottom to 5 at the top. Then spin the stack so that you can randomize the orientation of every tile in the stack, and then place them still in numerical order on the center base tile to create the machine core. Now look at the top factory tile and place a wall piece where the factory direction arrow points. Walls go on the edge between 2 habitat hexes. You then need to place a second wall on the next edge to the right of the first wall, and then lastly, place an engine piece on the next right edge from the second wall. Repeat this process on the opposite side of the factory tile where the number 5 is, but this time mirror the setup. So instead of moving right, move left. You'll end up with something that looks like this. Finish by placing 2 mechs on top of the factory tile. These are known as snipers. Mechs on the habitat hexes are known as hunters. And that's the map all set up. So let's move on to our player boards. Each player should choose a faction and then grab that faction's circle board. One side of the faction circle is for 2 to 3 players, and the other side is for a 4-player game. Place a camp piece on the 3 spot of the support track and fill up each spot to the right. In a 3-player game, don't place a camp marker in the final space, which has 2 dots under it. So in a 3 to 4-player game, you should have 5 camps on your support track, and in a 2-player game, you'll have all 6. Then place a pawn on the first space of the support track. Each player should pick 1 faction organizer and assemble their 12-card defender deck from the list on the organizer card. Shuffle up the deck and draw 3 cards as your starting hand. The other organizer cards, its pawn, and the unused defender cards can be put back into the box. Each different organizer has a unique deck with different special abilities. You can see a list of some of these on the back of the rulebook. Now each player receives 1 item token corresponding to the factions in play. So for our 2-player game, we only need the potions and the maps items, which are the Coven and Order items, respectively. Each of these start exhausted. Then each player gets 3 damage tokens and an equal share of the 12 breach markers. So in a 2-player game, each player takes 6. Make sure you have the 4 death tokens near the game board. And now it's time to set up the machine deck and determine difficulty. The machine deck is made up of 7 base cards. For your first game, just play with these, but in the future you can increase the difficulty by adding 1 to 6 of these difficult machine cards. Make sure to remove the equivalent base cards, so the machine deck is still only 7 cards, and then shuffle the deck. Finally, players remove their leftmost camp piece from their support track and place it on the map. It must be on their faction's preferred habitat and on a hex adjacent to the perimeter of the map. If that's not possible, then it must be 1 hex away from the perimeter. This is your starting camp, so place your organizer pawn there, randomly assign the first player token, and there you go. Setup is complete, we are ready to start playing. I'll be showing off a 2-player game during this tutorial, but it basically plays the same as a 3 or 4-player game. At the end of the video, I'll go over how to play the solo game because there are a few changes. Now, each round of Defenders of the Wild is played in 2 phases. The first is the organize phase, where each player is going to secretly and silently pick 1 defender card from their hand and then simultaneously reveal them. Once revealed, players can begin talking and strategizing for the round, but communication is not allowed while players select their cards. In fact, throughout the entire game, players are forbidden from discussing the specific cards in their hand. You may, however, note the habitat of the defender cards in your hand. For example, you could say, I currently don't have any forest defenders. These restrictions on communication are meant to simulate the uneasy alliance between the various factions. Keep in mind, if your hand is empty, you'll simply play the top card from your deck. So you'll always get to play a card each round. And if you ever need to draw a card and your deck is empty, simply shuffle your exhausted pile to form a new deck. At this point, we check to see if our cards have any special abilities that trigger when we reveal the cards, and both of ours do. Popel the Historian here says, Archives, reveal, gain maps. So we're just going to flip our map token here over to its active side. And Breck, the Medicine Cultivator, has Bubbling Brew, and they gain a potion. I'll explain what these items do when I use them. Some defenders will have a Comrade ability, and when that's revealed, you take the first player marker and you pass it to the next player on the left. And if multiple players were to reveal Comrade abilities, you would pass it to the left for each one revealed. We now move on to the second phase of each round, the action phase. Starting with the player holding the first player marker and moving clockwise around the table, each player will take as many actions as the number of action points noted in the lower left of their active defender card. In our case, each player is going to get 3 actions. Now you have a menu of 8 different actions you can choose from. It's all listed here on your handy dandy player aid card. And you can do them as many times and in any order that you want. I'll cover all of these actions as I play, but I think the first action I want to do as the order player is to destroy a mech. As you can see, we chose to start in this space with this mech, so we're just going to go ahead and use our first of 3 action points to destroy it. Now, anytime you take any action and you start in the same space as a mech, then you have to roll the damage die. We'd have to do this even if we were just moving out of the space or doing something else. That mech is always going to try to attack us back. Now, this die has single hit spots, some double hit spots, and then a blank spot as well. And when you're in the same space as a mech, you're going to engage in melee combat, which means both that side and the double side will count. Alternatively, if you were to try to take an action adjacent to these snipers, any mechs that are on top of factory tiles, including the factory core, are considered snipers. And so they're going to take shots at you even when you're adjacent to them. Anytime you take any action adjacent to snipers, they're going to take a shot at you, but these double spaces don't count. Only these single ones with the crosshairs count. Now, even if there's multiple mechs, you still only roll the dice once and resolve it. So in this case, that would be a miss. But you don't roll for each mech, you just roll one time. And if you were ever trying to take an action and it looks something like this, where you had both snipers, and you're in a space with a hunter, you'll just resolve the melee attack. And again, you'll only roll the dice once. So in that case, we would get hit twice. But we're over here. We're going to do this melee attack, trying to defeat that mech. So let's see what happens. Okay, we took 1 damage. Not too bad. We have our 3 damage tokens here, and so we'll just place 1 on there. You're able to withstand 3 damage. Now, if you ever take your 4th damage, you then suffer a defender death. You resolve a defender death by taking your hand of cards, randomly picking 1 out, ideally having another player do that. Whichever card is drawn, that defender dies, and you take that card and you place them underneath the corresponding death token, based on the defender's habitat. You would then clear all the damage off of your board, and if you happen to not have a hand of cards, then you would just kill the top defender card from your deck. And one way that you can lose the game is if you ever have 2 defenders killed from the same habitat. That would be an instant loss. Another way you can lose the game is by having all 6 of these toxic sites on the board and having to create a 7th one. You've then suffered a toxic disaster and you lose the game. Now I'll explain toxic sites here in a little bit. Now the third way that you can lose the game is if 5 factories have been built and you needed to build a 6th one. At that point, the machines have completed their construction and you lose the game. So there's 3 ways of losing the game, and there's only one way of winning. To do that, each player must build all of their camps out onto the board. In addition, the players must rewild all built factory tiles. If all camps have been built, and there's no active factories on the board, then you win. Now I'm going to talk about building camps and rewilding factories here in a little bit. So here we go. We took a damage from this mech, and now we just automatically destroy it. You can only destroy 1 mech per action, and when you do, you gain support from the locals for doing so. So you just move your support marker up on your support track. In order to build a new camp, we have to have our support completely maxed out. And so taking actions that gain us support, like destroying mechs, cleaning up pollution, breaching some of these walls, and rewilding factories is going to help us to build up our camps. You're going to see how all of that works here in just a second. So there we go. We're done with our first action. We have 2 more left. And I think for my second action, I want to move. In order to move your organizer figure, you must spend an action point, and then you can move to an adjacent hex. So I could move here, or I could move here, or down here. But there is a way that you can move a little bit further. Whichever habitat is showing on your active defender card. With Popple, the historian here, you can see it's showing forests. Any connected regions of that habitat are treated as if it's a single spot, a single hex. Thematically, that defender is familiar with that habitat and can move more efficiently through it. So this forest region is like one big space for our organizer because of the defender card that we played. So I could actually move through this spot and up to here as my one move. Because I'm sort of treating this whole area as one hex, and so then that would be my adjacent move. Now there are some restrictions. You cannot move through a wall unless it's been breached. And we're going to talk about breaching walls in a second. But for instance, if I was here, I would not be able to sort of move all the way through here and come down to here and then move there for my move because there's a wall blocking it. This wall would have to be breached for me to be able to do that. The engine pieces themselves are also blocking that kind of movement. Also, mechs force you to stop your movement. So if there was a mech right there, I wouldn't be able to move through there and come up to here. I'd have to stop in the location with the mech. But luckily for us, there's nothing there, so I can actually move through here and into there. For my third and final action, I want to clear pollution. Clearing pollution is really simple. You can take any number of pollution tokens in the hex with your organizer and remove it. And no matter how much you remove, you gain exactly 1 support for doing that. You can also use that action to remove a toxic site. Toxic sites form when 3 or more pollution markers are in the same hex. Later, you're going to see how pollution spreads, but let's say there were 2 pollution there and a third one would come in. We would then remove all 3 of those pollution and replace it with a toxic site. Again, clearing off toxic sites is really important because if there's ever 7 on the board, you lose. But you can just take the clear pollution action for 1 action point and remove it, returning it back to the board. The only difference is every time you remove a toxic site, you take 1 damage. But we just removed 1 pollution there, so we don't take any damage, we're fine. So there we go, that was the 3 actions that we get to take because of our defender card. But I'm not quite done because you can always on your turn as a free action use an item. And we have these maps here. These maps allow us to move or to regroup without spending an action. And also we could do it without having to roll damage if we were next to snipers or on the same hex as a hunter. Regrouping is an action that you can take to return back to one of your camps. So we could actually use this map to come all the way back to our camp over here. But instead, I just like to take a move action up to there. And when we use an item, we just flip it back over to its exhausted side. Now, once you're done taking your action, spending your action points, you can optionally do something called teaming up. Teaming up allows you to play extra cards from your hand in order to take extra actions. The extra cards that you play have to have the same habitat as your active defender card. So in this case, I have Rustle here. This fire monk has the same terrain, the forest terrain, as Popel. So I think I will have him team up. You place him underneath your active card, and you ignore this number here. You only get 1 extra action point. So we ignore that 4. We're going to get 1 more action. And I just want to clear pollution again. That's going to get us 1 more support. And there we go. We have now maxed out our support. This is going to let us build a camp, but we're going to have to wait till our next turn to do it because we're out of actions and I can't team up here with Lumits because they have a different terrain than our active defender. So the order player is completely done. At the end of the player's turn, when they're done spending their action points and optionally using items and optionally teaming up, you then want to resolve the top machine card. In this case, we got engines. Now you always resolve these cards from top to bottom. So the first thing it says is that the engines are going to advance twice. We want to look at the direction marker here and you can see it's pointing to the right. So both of our engines are going to move twice to the right. And you can see the meeples here have a 1 sprocket side and a 2 sprocket side to show the difference between right and left, just to help out. So this engine's going to go 1, 2, and then we place down walls. And this one's going to go 1, 2. And we place out walls. Now, if an engine were to ever move into a dead end, so for example, the next time this engine moves, it's going to reach a dead end. Both the left and the right path have a factory on each edge. And again, every factory tile is assumed to have 6 walls around it. So this engine has reached a dead end. When that happens, you just move the engine onto the core, sort of end its movement. You'd put a wall here. And then after you resolve the other movement, you would then go to step 2 here, which says deploy reset engines. And you would do that starting with the highest number factory. So in this case, we would do it just from the core here. But if this factory, this number 5 factory had been built somewhere else, then we would start from there. And the way you would deploy it is you would look at the arrow and try to deploy it there. If it was blocked by a wall or another engine, then you would move in either the left or right direction around the factory, depending on whether the location marker was on the right or the left. So it's on the right, so then we'd move to this one. This one would have a wall there, and so you'd move on to the next one, and it would get deployed right there. You'd keep going around trying to deploy it. If you couldn't, then you'd go to the next highest numbered factory. But we didn't have to worry about that this time. Now, another funny little thing that could happen is, let's say the engine was right here. Its next move is going to take it here to the boundary. So when that happens, you go all the way around until you're no longer on the boundary. So for its first move, it would go all the way around over to here, building walls all around. And that would just be its first move. Then it would take its second move like that. So that's what you do anytime it reaches the boundary. But there we go. We resolve the engines. We are done. We then move clockwise around the table. So in our case, it's now the Coven player's turn. The Coven player also has 3 action points, and they're going to do something very similar to the Order player. They're going to first start by attacking that mech. So we got to roll for damage. Oh, and gets 2 hits. 2 damage, not good. But does destroy the mech and gets a support. For their second action, they're going to move. And I was thinking about having them move all the way to there. Okay, remember the movement rules. It can get a little tricky, but because they played Breck, and his habitat is the mountains, then for one move, they can move into here and then treat this whole thing as one hex. And so they could end right there. I was then going to have them come in here and maybe attack that mech over there, but because they took 2 hits, I don't think they want to mess with the mechs anymore. So instead, I'm just going to have them move right here, and then for their third action, clear off some pollution. That also gives them a support. Now, with this potion item, they could remove one of their damage, or they could clear a pollution without spending an action point. And again, you would not roll for damage when you use that item. I think I'm going to hold on to that because I want them to clear off some of the pollution here around these snipers, and this potion will let them do it without having to roll for damage. So we're going to hold on to that, probably spend it next turn. So I think that the Coven player is done. They can't team up because their other defenders in their hand have a different habitat. So at the end of their turn, they resolve a machine card. Ooh, and it's Mechs. So the first thing that happens is that each engine is going to deploy a hunter. Now they're going to deploy the hunter to the hex that's directly in front of them. So this one's going to deploy a mech right there. And in the case of this engine, it's directly facing a factory. So if the engine is either facing a factory or the perimeter of the board, then instead you're going to deploy to the hex that's either to the right or to the left, depending again on the direction marker. In this case, it's going to deploy to the right of this hex, which would be right there. Now, the second thing that's going to happen is that these hunters are going to pursue. And they're going to pursue the active player up to 2 hexes away, and all other players up to 1 hex away. So how does that work? Each one of these mechs is going to see if it's within 2 hexes from the active player's organizer. So in this case, it's the Coven player. So none of these mechs are within 2 spaces. These mechs are clearly out of range, so they're going to hold their position. They're not going to move at all. Only the hunters pursue, so these snipers that are here on the machine core, they're going to stay put as well. And none of these other ones are within range. Now the hunters are going to go around the table, going clockwise, and pursue the other players, the non-active players. But for them, they have to be 1 hex away. And so the only mech that is 1 hex away from the order player is that one. So it's going to move in. All the other ones are going to stay put. Now keep in mind that mechs will not go through walls in order to pursue, and that includes breached walls. They will not go through a wall whether it's breached or not. And they will also never pursue into a factory or a rewild space. And also, any mech that's already in a spot with any organizer of any player, they will hold their position no matter what. And there we go. That's the mech card completely sorted, all done. Now, these cards that were used are going to go into a discard pile. Each player has a personal discard pile. And now that all the players have gone, that's the end of the first round. We immediately go into round 2 with the organize phase. And keep in mind, we don't draw cards. The only way that you get to draw new cards into your hand is when you build camps, which we're going to see here in this round. So once again, the players would silently and simultaneously pick a defender card from their hand to play for this round. For the order player, this is the only card that they have, so they're going to play that one. The Coven player has a choice of these two. They're going to choose Brennan, the Mystic Mender. They would then reveal, and now they can talk about their plans again. And the order player still has the first player marker, so they get to go first. But before we do that, Brennan does have a reveal ability which says choose a player to remove all damage. And I think they're going to choose themselves. Now, Lumitz here, the Fireboxer, also has a special ability, but it's an ongoing one for this round. And it says, gain 1 support whenever you take any amount of damage. Now, that's not going to come in super handy because they are already maxed out on their support. And so they're not going to be able to gain any more support until they build their camp, which is what they wanted to do as their first action until this mech rudely came into their space. So first, they're going to try to destroy that mech as their first action. So we're going to roll the die. Okay. Just taking 1 damage, not too bad. They get rid of the mech, which would have given them a support, and they would have gotten a support here by taking any amount of damage, but unfortunately that's all going to go to waste. And now for their second action, they're going to build a camp. They can do this because their support is completely maxed out and is next to the camp that they want to build. So they're going to take that camp. They have to build these in their faction's favored habitat, which is the forest. There also can only be 1 camp on each hex. When they build the camp, you reset the support marker. And now we get to draw cards into our hand until our hand is equal to whatever number we revealed. So in this case, 4. We basically get to draw back up to 4 cards. As you can see, each time you build a camp, you're going to need a little bit more support in order to build the next one. Now, when a player has played all of their camps, that player then exits the game. They're completely done, and the rest of the players keep playing. When the final player builds their final camp, and all the factory tiles that have been built have been rewilded, then all players win the game. And I think for their last action, they are going to do a heal action. You can do a heal action as long as you're in a hex with any player's camp. It doesn't just have to be your own. And that lets you remove all of your damage. Now, if you had to roll for damage, because you're taking an action near snipers or in the same location as a hunter, you would clear off all your damage first and then roll for damage. And there we go. That's their 3 actions. They can't team up because we have all different terrain types there. So they're done. Draw a machine card. And we got the factories card. This is how the machines are going to build new factories and spread pollution. So the first step there is that if any of these hexes were completely surrounded by walls, and we don't have that here yet. You can see this one is close, but it still needs 1 more wall segment. But let's say this hex here had 1 more wall, then it would be fully enclosed because, again, this side is considered to be a wall. In that case, we would remove all of these walls. We would place this tile on there, maintaining its orientation, and everything that's in this hex, as well as that's on this factory tile, would remain. That includes toxic sites, pollution tokens, mechs, all the rest. You would also maintain any breached wall segments that happen to be there. So that breached wall would not go away. That side would still be considered breached, even after the factory is built. If the new factory is built on top of a camp, then that camp stays built on that factory tile, but it can no longer be used for regrouping and healing. At least not until that factory is rewilded. Then it can. Also, if the factory is placed on top of your organizer, then your organizer would stay on that factory. And when you do this and move it over, you would then place 2 more mechs on top of the machine core to become 2 more snipers. Now, for each one of these cards, they're only going to build 1 factory. If you have multiple enclosed locations, it's going to choose between them by looking at where the direction arrow is, and then either moving to the left or the right, depending on the direction marker, until it gets to the first hex, and then it will choose to build in that hex. If it does build a factory, then that's the end of the card. You're done resolving the card. If, however, you don't build a factory, then instead, the factories are going to spread pollution. You're going to look at these smokestacks that are on the factories, and you're going to do this for every factory that's been built, and each one is going to add a pollution to the adjacent hex. Again, if that would create 3 pollution in a hex, then you would replace it with a toxic site. But if there was already a toxic site in one of those places, so let's say there was a toxic site here instead, then it would skip over that and place it in the following hex. It's not going to place more pollution where there's already a toxic site. Keep in mind when resolving that, you're always going to start with the factory that has the highest number and then work down. And pollution can be spread onto factories and even onto the machine core. Also, pollution will never spread onto the border of the map. And there we go. That's the factory card completely resolved. Okay, now the Coven player gets to go. They have 3 actions. First, they want to move, and they're just going to move right over here into this adjacent hex. They're going to spend their potion rather than taking an action. And their potion is going to let them take a clear pollution action without having to roll for damage, right? Because otherwise they would have had to roll for those 2 snipers. They get to remove all the pollution and boom, get a support. They are now maxed out on support as well. They still have 2 more actions left. For their second one, they're going to build their camp, reset the support, draw up to 4. So they already had a card in their hand, so they draw until their hand is 4. And because they took that action next to these snipers, they got a roll. Aha! There we go. That one doesn't count when dealing with snipers, so that's a miss. I think for their last action, they're just going to move down to here. Now again, moving where the snipers are, they're going to have to roll. Ah, and that time they get hit. But just for 1, not a big deal. And there we go. They are done. Reveal a machine card. And there we go. That is the final type of machine card. This is the Reboot card. Now, the first thing we do is we switch the direction. We're going to move from the right to the left. After we do that, the Reboot card functions just like a factory card. So we would search for any enclosed areas. We don't have any, so instead it's going to spread pollution. And there we go. We have 3 pollution markers there, so it becomes a toxic site. You've now seen every type of machine card. Once you've played all of them, you would then shuffle up this deck and create a new deck. And now there's just a few actions that you haven't seen. For 1 action point, you can return to one of your camps. Now, unlike with the move action, the regroup action is not restricted by distance or by obstacles. You just sort of teleport to whatever one of your camps you want to. Also keep in mind that you don't get an item when you do this. Now, the way you would normally get an item is by moving, taking a move action and ending at a camp. When you do that, you can take the item that is corresponding to the camp. So if the Order player even had moved into a spot with the Coven's camp, then they would get a potion. Just like that. But you don't get that reward when you move by doing a regroup. Now, another action that you could take is to breach a wall. Now, you have a limited number of breach tokens, and once you've used it, it stays there. But by breaching a wall, you can now move through that wall. That gains you a support. Now, also, you can breach one of these walls, or you can also breach a factory wall. So let's say this factory had been built here. You could breach this wall as well, which would be necessary for you to be able to move into a factory. Because you have to remember these factories are considered to be completely surrounded by walls. If you run out of breach tokens, then you can't take the breaching action anymore. You're out of luck. And the final action that I haven't talked about is rewilding factories. This is critical because you have to rewild all the factories that get built before you can win the game. Now, in order to rewild a factory, all pollution and mechs on that factory need to be cleared off. And so we'd first have to take a couple of destroy mech actions before we could rewild that tile. But once it's clear, you can then take an action to flip it over. You want to maintain its orientation. Now, rewilded factories are still considered to be surrounded by walls, and so you're going to maintain that breach token again. This action also gains you a support, and now this becomes kind of a wild terrain tile. Any player, any faction can build a camp there, but again, only one camp per hex, and it can be considered as any terrain for movement purposes. So you could move through it like that, as long as both walls that you're moving through have already been breached. Also keep in mind that you can never move onto this core or rewild it. You can only rewild the factories once they get built onto the map. And there you go. That's basically all the different actions that you can take. Now, there are 2 additional items that could be in play depending on the factions. The Sect item is rockets, and you can use rockets to destroy a mech or breach a wall without spending an action point. And like the others, you won't roll damage when using the rockets. And then the Council item is bread. Using bread gives you 1 additional action point to spend on any action. There's also some more difficult machine cards that you can add to the deck in order to make the game more difficult. For the difficult engines, 1 engine will advance 3 times, while the other will advance twice. In order to determine which engine will advance 3 times, you first must check the machine direction. You then find the factory direction arrow pointing off the factory tile on top of the machine core. You follow the direction of that arrow, scanning in a straight line from the core to the board perimeter, and then you rotate and scan around the core in the specified machine direction until the scan hits an engine. That will be the engine that you advance 3 spaces, and then the other one you'll advance 2. For the difficult factories, pollution is always spread regardless of whether you built a factory or not. And then for the difficult mechs, a 3rd step is added that requires all players with organizers and hexes with mechs to take 1 damage. Now, you can add 1 to 2 of these cards at random for an intermediate game, 3 or 4 cards for an expert game, and then 5 or 6 for an extreme game. Remember that you must substitute each drawn difficult card for a corresponding base card with the same name in order to compose a deck of 7 cards. Now, while Defenders of the Wild is primarily designed as a multiplayer game, it can still be enjoyed alone with just a few tweaks to the rules. You're going to want to set up the game with 2 factions, just as I've done in this tutorial. But instead of dealing each faction 3 cards as their starting hand, you're instead going to deal yourself a 3-card hand that is composed of any combination of cards from the 2 factions' decks. So, for example, I could take 2 cards from the Order player and 1 card from the Coven player. Or I could do all 3 from 1. You can obviously ignore all the communication rules. You don't have to deal with that. And then on each turn of the game, you get to decide which card you want to play. And whichever defender card you choose, that's going to be the active faction. So in that way, a single faction could take multiple turns in a row. You just have to make sure that after your turn, each turn, you're going to be drawing a machine card. Now, if you have no defender cards from one of the factions in your hand, you can still draw from the top of that faction's deck and use that as your active defender. You would still activate reveal abilities immediately when you play the card, and special abilities marked ongoing would continue to affect the gameplay for as long as the defender with the ability is on top of its exhaust pile. Just as normal, a defender's special ability affects only its faction unless noted otherwise. And you can only team up with defender cards from the faction that's active. You can't mix and match those. Also keep in mind that when you take an action to build a camp, you're going to rebuild your hand as normal, but you can only draw from the active faction's deck. If you suffer a faction death, then you're going to shuffle up your full hand and draw one at random, just as you normally would. So it's possible a defender from the other faction could end up getting killed. And when you build a faction's final camp, place all of its defenders in your hand in the exhaustion pile. That faction then completely exits the game, and you continue playing with the other faction. And there you go. That's everything you need to know in order to play Defenders of the Wild. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.